we'll get underway. My name is Fergal Quinn. I'm the subject leader for journalism here at the University of Limerick. So on behalf of the journalism department here, I'd like to welcome you all to this symposium on the subject of how journalists report on mental health related stories and the particular challenges that they face in doing so. As a topic, I think it's a very timely one. The coverage of mental health related issues presents particularly tricky challenges to those who work in media. I think we can all agree on that. There have been huge strides made in Irish society as a whole in recent years in terms of the general awareness of and sensitivity towards a wider spectrum of mental health related problems. But even as this progress has been made, I think it's also highlighted our lack of understanding in this area, whether it be the overall incidence of mental health issues, the range and scope of these specific issues, the kinds of treatment available, and the debate over the effectiveness of these treatments, the various developments in science and medicine that are challenging paradigms of how we characterise these types of disorders. And all this raises so many questions for journalists. Questions like, are we communicating this type of information sensibly and clearly when we're reporting on it? What is the best way to approach mental health related topics in a way that's sensitive to sufferers, that helps those involved in treating them, while also informing the public? While these broader questions will be discussed over the next couple of hours, a major focus this morning is on the particular moments when mental health discussion in the media is an element of particular catastrophic news events which affect the wider populace. Because it's here, I think, that the limits of and problems with our current journalistic approach are brought into the sharpest focus. A pilot, in a seemingly deliberate act, crashes a plane load of passengers into a mountainside. A grade A student goes on a shooting rampage in a cinema. A man with no recorded history of violence murders his wife and children before taking his own life. Inexplicable, horrific events that we struggle as a society to make sense of. A narrative which includes mental health related issues can often be a compellingly comprehensible explanation to reach for. The pilot was being treated for depression. The gunman was schizophrenic. But are such explanations sometimes reached for too quickly, even without credible medical evidence? Does the instinctive conflation of such extreme acts with commonly known mental health issues in fact add to damaging stereotypes, fear and misinformation? Are we properly differentiating between mental health issues and other perhaps more complex types of personality disorders? Conversely, does not reporting on these aspects of a case mean we're not giving our viewers and readers a complete picture? What ethical framework or guidelines can journalists who are under severe time and resource pressures use which are realistic and practical when approaching such stories? So lots of questions. The event today, I suppose, is less about trying to comprehensively answer any of these questions than it is about facilitating a meaningful conversation. You'll hear today from journalists and editors who have covered and continue to cover these types of stories. Health communicators who try and inform and educate the public on these types of issues. Academics who study and analyse reporting patterns on them. And from someone who used their direct experience of some of the issues discussed to advocate for change of the Mental Health Act specifically. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers here for taking time off from your very busy schedules to contribute. I'd also like to thank Audrey and Galvin in particular for conceptualising and driving this event from the very beginning. Audrey, who's part of our teaching team in journalism at UL, is conducting really interesting research on the topic of mental health coverage in the media. Both herself and Catherine Hayes in particular worked really hard to bring together what I think is a fantastic lineup of people. So it just remains for me to introduce our keynote speaker. We're delighted to have Professor Jane Singer with us here today. Professor Singer is the Director of Research and Professor of Journalism Innovation in the Department of Journalism in City University in London, which is among the foremost universities globally for the teaching and research on journalism. She spent time as a journalist at the forefront of that initial wave of digitization of newsrooms, etc., before moving into academia, where she specialised in, among other things, on journalism ethics and journalists' responses to technological change. Professor Singer has been an innovative, hugely respected and very accessible thinker and researcher in this area for a number of years now, and we're very grateful to her for joining us today for a presentation entitled Habits of Practice, Habits of Thought. So Jane, I'm just going to pass you over here. Make sure all this in order.
Thank you so much for a very nice introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm just delighted to be here, and it's great to see the sun as well as all of you. And thanks to Audrey and all of her colleagues for putting this together. It's a fantastic lineup, and I'm really happy to be part of it. But I have to apologize in advance, is that I'm actually not going to talk about mental health. I don't know a lot about coverage of mental health. I'm kind of here to learn about that. So what I want to talk a little bit about, though, instead, and I hope this works, but happy to talk about it more interactively afterwards if we have time, is an idea I've just started to kind of kick around. So it's in a kind of formative stage here, so would love your feedback on whether this makes sense and what you make sense of it, what sense you make of it, and how you can help me think about it. But I'm calling it habits of practice and habits of thought, and so see if this makes sense to you as I go through it. Now, I have a few references in here to kind of issues related to mental health, but I do warn you that's not my strength, so bear with me there. I'm going to start by talking just a little bit about a different survey, a survey that I did of my students, and also actually we did this with some students in the Netherlands as well, about a different topic. The topic was about what they thought about journalism innovation and what they thought about entrepreneurial journalism, and we were trying to get at, are they thinking about those things which actually are somewhat related, or are they thinking about them in different ways? Which I'm not going to talk about. I can talk about that with you separately if you're interested. But I wanted to pull out what they said about change, about the notion of change, because I think this relates to this idea that what's changing in journalism is the way we do things, but not so much the way we think about things. And I hope that that's somewhat relevant to what you're going to be working through today. And this is just a few questions from the survey. This wasn't, again, really what the survey was about, but nonetheless, I thought it was kind of interesting. So is journalism changing? So students say, these were students at City and also students in the Netherlands, although the figure I have on here is just the students at City, so a larger group. Is journalism different from the way it was? Yes, absolutely. 95% of them agree with that. And I think the others, were neutral. So overwhelming agreement that yes, it's different. And in fact, it needs to be different. So that's good that it's different. It's important that it's different. It needs to change because society is changing, and it needs to change in order to be relevant. So again, overwhelming agreement with that. But then this year, so we're trying to get at, well, what do they think change actually means? That first question we asked 2 years. The second question we asked just this year. So what do you mean when you say journalism is changing? Well, it turns out that what they mean is something kind of specific about that, because they don't think journalism should be changing in relation to some of the broader things that we think journalism is about, like holding those with power to account, contributing to positive change in society, and overwhelming agreement with that as well. So journalism changing in some ways is not another. Well, you can probably figure out what they're thinking about, what you're probably thinking about as well. So the way that journalism is changing as students, people who are about to enter the field, some of them have experience in the field at City, we have a much larger master's program actually than undergraduate program, so most of these students were master's students and a lot of them did have some experience. So how is journalism changing? Well, when they think about how journalism is changing, they're really thinking about technological change. They're thinking about it being different because it's now digital, and it's now social, and it's now mobile, and it's now all those different kind of technological things. And that came through in several questions, but in particular it came through when we asked them in kind of an open-ended question to say, well, what do you, give me a term, like free word association, what do you think about when you think about journalism innovation? These are the things they think about, overwhelmingly, these things. So there were total in this group of City journalists of 169, and in that group we had something like 65 mentions of just social media, social network, social. Free association, what do you mean by change? That's a lot, right? That's really what they're thinking about. With terms related to technology, all of the terms that are on here, which are all really, really similar, there's different ways of saying the same thing, particularly the last three, were mentioned at least 30 times among 170 students. So that's really what they're thinking about. So perhaps that's a little bit of a contradiction. They think journalism is changing, but this is how they think it's changing. It's a pretty narrow definition of how they think it's changing. Now maybe you could say, well, of course students think that because students generally are young. The average age of our respondents here was 23, so they were quite young. So to me that's quite young. To some of you that may not seem, to me it seems very and so you might say, well, perhaps that's just kind of, normal that millennials, younger people think that they are, in fact, are good with digital technology. They grew up with it. They're very comfortable with it. So maybe it's comfortable. They would say, well, that's how it's changing because that's what I know and that's what I'm good at. But I would suggest that if you actually went and asked this of working journalists, people who are actually out there in the profession, they would probably say much the same thing, I would guess. There's been lots and lots of studies that have done talking to journalists about how they're adapting to change. And what they talk about when you talk to journalists about how they're adapting to change is how they're adapting to technical change, how they're adapting to the fact that it's now digital, the fact that it's now, they have to do lots of different things, they have to learn how to shoot video, they have to be proficient with filing stories through mobile phone, all those different kinds of things. A lot of research has shown, and trade press reports have shown, and journalists have talked about how they have to change to do those things. And they do, and that's important. And that does change in ways that are interesting, and we're thinking about how journalism is done. It certainly affects change. It changes in the way that we report sensitive stories, like the stories that we just heard about as examples at the start here. Yes, certainly that does change it, but it changes it in a kind of concrete, technical sort of a way. So I think that's kind of interesting. And when we're thinking about what's different about what we do today, what we're thinking about is what's different in a technological sense. And I'll also just kind of point out, because we were talking a little bit about ethics today, that each of those changes that I have on here, and there are more besides, that's what would fit on my slide. I have a very boring slide. I should have apologized at the start for the boringness of my PowerPoint slides. They're just text. But each of those changes that have come about, and others as well, starting with the internet itself, have been met with resistance, and they've been met with resistance by journalists in the newsroom, largely on normative grounds. I've done a little bit of work about this, and it's actually kind of interesting when you think about it. So the internet was, we didn't really like the internet because it was going to put this emphasis on speed, and speed would make it difficult for us to verify information, and that was a problem. That was kind of the first reaction to the internet. And we can talk about that more. It's not really my main point here. We'll get diverted. But then as each of these things has come along, multimedia would take time away. If I'm going to have to be out there shooting video, which I don't really know how to do, it's going to take time away from my talking to people, from being on the ground, from getting information. If I have to compete with bloggers, well, bloggers, what are they? People in their pajamas, the stereotypical classification of bloggers. They don't really know what they're doing. They're not objective. They're not doing what I do as a journalist, and so on and so on. So each of those things is met with resistance at the start, and the resistance has been on kind of normative, ethical sorts of grounds, but then of course they've been incorporated pretty much wholesale into what journalists do and their habits of practice. So that's what I'm talking about with habits of practice related to journalism. They have changed dramatically. There's not to discount all of the extra work, frankly, that journalists have to do, different kinds of work that journalists have to do, accommodations that they've had to make to all kinds of different things as they've come along and continue to come along as we speak. So it's not to say that that's not a substantive change, it is, but it's a change in the way we do things and how we do what we do. And that's about as far as it goes, I would suggest. I did try to just kind of toss some things out there that you can think about as we go through the morning and talk about kind of issues related to sensitive stories, to mental health issues, to coverage of things that are difficult to cover. Those new technologies have, I think, introduced new concerns, new ethical concerns about how we go about doing some of these things. The first one that popped into my head, and again, you will know more about many of these than I do, but the first thing that popped in my head was digital doorstepping. That's kind of what we do now. It's kind of what journalists do. When there's a tragedy, when there's a suicide, when there's a murder, when there's a horrific traffic accident, whatever it might be. Journalists always hated having to go and knock on a door and talk to someone who's in shock and grief. And now they don't have to. Now they can go onto Facebook and find those people and talk with them that way. It raises all kinds of other ethical issues, but that has, I think, changed the way journalists do some of that. And I'm not necessarily sure for the better. I think that can be very intrusive in different kinds of ways. And it's different from looking someone in the eye and talking to them about a person they've just lost and typing a note on Facebook and saying, "Do you want to talk about this?" I think that's substantively different. But anyway, a different technical practice. Photographs of dead people, this has just kind of struck me in the past few years that I see a lot of them. And I tend to read, The Guardian and the Times, New York and London, and, pretty high quality, sorry, but those are high quality news organizations. So it's not just the tabloids that are running more photographs of dead people, and moreover, they're not dead people. I mean, this is horrible enough that they were dead people in far away, distant places. Nor are they necessarily, well, they are this as well, pictures of mass numbers of dead people that you can't really see the individual. I see a lot of pictures up close of dead people. I think that is, why has that changed? I don't think officially there's been even a kind of normative change. I don't think there's been a legal change. I think my proposal, I don't have any research on this, would be that it's because they're so ubiquitous online. There's so many issues, there's so many pictures you can find online of whatever you like, that it's just become perhaps it's become normalized in some way. We can talk about that, and what you think about that. And probably the most obvious one, I guess, is the idea of media contagion. I hope I'm using that term correctly. The copycat crimes, the fact that this is so widely spread. Some of the examples we just heard about did not happen. None of the examples we just heard about happened in Ireland. I believe they happened in other places. Some of them happened in America. Some of them happened very far away. But we knew about them instantly, and everyone knew about them, and everyone was talking about them. And I think there's some concerns. Would people independently have gotten the brilliant idea to take a big truck and plow it through a crowd of people? Well, maybe they would have. Maybe they got that idea from other channels, but maybe they got the idea because it got so much coverage online. And we're going to see more of them. So those kinds of issues related to changes in technical things in practice. So what I want to say about that. I want to finish by saying a little bit about what I'm tentatively calling habits of thought. You can think about this as journalistic culture. You can think about this as how journalists think about what they do, why they do it, what their role is, how they should go about not just technically doing things, how they should go about shooting video is a different issue, but how they should fulfill their role in society. Those I think are the way we think about journalism, and they are incredibly deeply rooted. It is, there's this socialization process that takes place, and it takes place in university. Maybe you come in with that before you enter university, but it's certainly strengthened in the university environment, and then it's kind of cemented when you get into a newsroom environment. The way we think about what we do, the way we think about who we are as occupational, the people in an occupational role, and it's very, very, very resistant to change. I can't get my students who are 22 years old to think about this differently, and I don't think you can get a 45-year-old journalist to think about it differently. I think that was even harder. And I'm not saying, and I'm going to go through some things, and you're going to feel defensive about some of these things. I know. I'm not saying that they should necessarily think about things differently. I think some of the things and the way that we think about things are very important. They are about public service and a role in a democratic society and all those kinds of things. Nonetheless, when you're really closed off to the way you think about things, and I think we are, that means that you're not thinking about them in a different way. All right? So you're not kind of open to other ways of thinking about things, other ways of thinking about things and other ways of doing things. So there's a trade-off. So let me talk about these three things. And again, my premise here is that there's very, very little critical thinking among journalists about these kind of bedrock sorts of beliefs about who we are and what we do. Sorry, I'm already over time. I apologize. I will whip through these, and we can talk about them in more detail later. Audiences, this is kind of a surface level one. In some ways, I think we tend to think still about, we may say that we don't, but we do still tend to think about audiences as the people out there who receive the information that we produce. And you can talk and talk and talk about how it's an interactive medium and how we have to engage people and how we have to think about this differently. And people talk about this. All kinds of news organizations have hired audience engagement editors and all kinds of other people whose job it is to get journalists to think differently. And I think by and large, journalists really don't think very differently, in my view. I think audiences are still, how do we engage with audiences? Well, they give us tips, they serve as sources, they give us quotes, that's great, but we're still producing the information, providing the information. Metrics, great, but it's still my news judgment, actually maybe not so great, I'm so concerned about the use of metrics. And social media, well, we just don't, yeah. We use it, we get our stories out, we use it to promote information, we use it to get sources and get tips, but yeah, we're kind of nervous about that. This one's really going to make you defensive, I know. I know from experience of trying to talk to people about this. Objectivity. We absolutely are committed to objectivity. I think we think about it the wrong way. I think we think about it as being, we think about it in useful ways, but the ways we operationalize those things don't necessarily give us great journalism. They give us sometimes false balance, they give us false equivalences, they give us quoting one source and then another just because then we've been balanced. I think they give us the wrong kinds of things. I think the better way to think about objectivity for journalists is that you're open-minded, that you're open to good ideas or good viewpoints or good actions from all kinds of different people. I think journalists might agree with that, but I think what they tend to associate objectivity with are these things on the bottom of the slide. Sorry, I know I'm flying through this because taking up too much of your time. And then this one I'm going to get defensive about as well. I'm not necessarily a fan of solutions journalism, the idea there being that journalists not just present the problems, we're really good about presenting problems, we're really good about telling you about that murder-suicide. We might even be okay at telling you about some services that are available to help people, but we're still kind of, we're not really engaging you in understanding how you can deal. You can take action about that problem, and that leaves us, of course, and of course that's a difficult problem to take action with that's effective in any way, but nonetheless, we're still kind of positioning the audience as being on the receiving end of information and not really helping people understand what they can do. What do I do about these massive problems in our society? I think journalists see it as not necessarily their job to enable people to see what it is that they might do. Perhaps that's correct in many instances, but again, it's a closed-minded way of thinking. Perhaps there are other ways to think about this. And my very last slide is just to summarize and say that I think the practice of journalism, the way we do journalism, has changed enormously in the digital era, in the past 20 years or 15 years or 10 years or 5 years, whatever you want to, whatever segment of that you want to think about. Each technology that comes along does change how we do things. But I think we change very little in how we think about what journalism is and does. I think some of that is very valuable, actually. I think we should have bedrock principles that we don't violate. So don't misinterpret it. I'm not saying that they're not important principles. What I am saying, though, is that they close us off to thinking about other things in ways that might be productive and that we might discover can fit into the principles, but enable us to think about what we're doing a little bit differently. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, next we're going to, I'm Henry Silk from UL. Next we're going to have the presentation section. We've got some very interesting presentations. Firstly from Audrey Galvin, who's from UL, that Fergal mentioned, organised this event and is doing research in the area of mental health and journalism. Then we will have Professor Ella Arensman, if I pronounced that correctly. And she is from the National Suicide Research Foundation. Next then we will have Claire Sheeran, who is from Headline, and then finally we will have Sean, or Headline, what would you describe Headline as?
Managing of
mental health. Yeah, exactly. And then Sean Donlon, who is the chairman of the Press Council.
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everyone. My research is looking at the framing of murder-suicide. So how do journalists use imagery, use language to convey how a particular phenomenon is understood in society? And so in this particular instance, It's to do with the whole issue of murder-suicide in itself. So, I suppose despite the news media's substantial role in shaping society's perceptions of social issues, including murder-suicide, minimal research has been conducted to examine the ethics employed in the framing of murder-suicide, and in particular how the media conceptualise murder-suicide, and none has actually been done in Ireland to date. So responding to this, my research hopes to expand our knowledge concerning the media's approach in framing murder-suicide, and it hopes to explore the ethics employed by journalists and editors and how they covered stories of this nature. I think other speakers are going to speak to the causal factors in their research and how other forms of media, such as social media, can play a role, and how a phenomenon such as murder-suicide is understood by society. So I'm going to look at three particular cases. The first is the Graney family, the O'Donovan family, and the Hall family, and I'm just going to put up some brief research that I did into how those stories were reported in the first 24 hours after news of the tragedies emerged. So we can see here with the Graney murder-suicide, which occurred on December 28th, 2014. The morning after the incident, we know that Michael Graney stabbed his wife, then stabbed his daughter, before turning the knife on himself. We know less than 24 hours after the murder-suicide who did it, what order the victims died or were injured, and it's described or labelled as a shocking bloodbath. We're also given an idea as to the state of mind of Michael Graney. We're told that the physiotherapist, who comes from a highly respected Cove family, was suffering from depression, stress and insomnia at the time, as well as suicidal tendencies. And a couple of days later, we have an idea of motive. We're told by the media that Mr. Graney was under financial stress. On December 4th, 2014, Jonathan O'Driscoll killed his brothers, Patrick and Thomas. Less than 24 hours again, we know a timeline of what happened. They were stabbed multiple times. We have intimate detail of the attack. Both boys were in their school uniforms and were found by their younger brothers, aged 3 and 5. And we also have a possible motive. We're told that there were psychological issues involved. In the case of the Hall murder-suicide in August 2016, again less than 24 hours later, we know who the perpetrator was. We know how the murder-suicide was carried out. We're given detail that the children were in their pyjamas when they were killed. We're told the boys and Clodagh Hall suffered horrific injuries, and that a knife and hatchet were among a number of items taken away for forensic analysis. We're also told that Mr. Hall didn't have any financial issues and that the family themselves were normal and outwardly happy. So again, this is just to illustrate, I suppose, the immediacy within which the media culture and the expedient culture within which journalists operate. I'm now just going to go ahead and look at the newsworthiness of murder-suicides. So what makes it newsworthy? Why is there such an interest in them? So according to a study examining newspaper reporting of mental illness in murder-suicide in particular in the UK, we're told the tabloid newspapers exhibited a fascination with the level of violence involved in the incident. This referred to the violence against the victim in the murder rather than the suicide, and the deaths of vulnerable or innocent victims added a further tragic element to the story. And this is not just true of tabloids, it's also true of broadsheets. In addition to labelling the victims and offenders as good or evil, the status of the victim was elevated due to their profession. How are they reported? The portrayal of murder-suicides in the media seem to reinforce stereotypes and oversimplify the context of these events. Elderly couples with declining health are described as being devoted to each other. Journalists assumed an emphatic attitude towards the offender and the couple's situation in general. Commonly referred to as mercy killings, a similar sympathetic tone was observed in cases of filicide, where mothers where a child was killed for perceived altruistic reasons. However, fathers who killed their children did not receive the same level of sympathy. Direct quotations from family and friends were used to generate a profile of the offender, and these descriptions provided insight into how the person was perceived and consequently the image of the offender in the media, which again goes back to the whole idea of framing. The witness descriptions of the perpetrator differed depending on the newspaper and the informant quoted, and comments regarding the offender's mental state were prominent in several newspaper headlines. I'm now going to go on and speak a little bit about the role that the media have. According to aspects of the Code of Practice that deal with the reporting of suicide and murder-suicide, this deals with Principle 5, and Principle 5.3 states that sympathy and discretion must be shown at all times in seeking information in situations of personal grief or shock. In publishing such information, the feelings of grieving families should be taken into account. It should not be interpreted as restricting the right to report on judicial proceedings. And this is important. This is a principle that governs not only what may be published by journalists, but it also amounts to a sea change in the norm of accountability, and also looks at the conduct of journalists. So moving forward and looking at the whole area of exploitation perhaps, and what counts as exploitation, I think it's important as a practitioner myself, it's a mistake to conclude that journalists shouldn't cover stories of this nature. They are in the public interest, but I guess it's important to look at how they cover them. So to exploit is to unfairly use people in a less powerful position to achieve your own ends without a thought to their needs and interests. And the basic principles of ethics is to not treat other people only as a means to your own ends. So the word only here is crucial. It acknowledges that we often legitimately use other people as a means to our goals. And in journalism, Kant's principle here works in the following way. In reporting on a person's tragedy, the journalist is aware on one level, treating the event as a means to my end of getting the story. But on another level, the journalist is not exploiting the situation if they treat the person in question with respect and attempt to minimise harm. So what kind of questions does my research hope to answer, or to at least construct a debate on? So how is murder-suicide framed by media in Ireland? And what ethical frameworks, if any, are applied in the framing of murder-suicide stories by journalists and, importantly, editors in print media in Ireland? My research ultimately will be done through a framing analysis of media content of cases of murder-suicide incidents, and followed up then second-fold with interviews with media professionals, journalists and editors to talk me through their framing process. So from going out and interviewing people involved with the case, Gardaí, what was your process from the time you left your news desk to print the following day concerning a particular case, and also speaking with editors and talking me through what language is used, why that language was used, and without judgment, looking at that process that they employed, and then what ethics were employed in writing and covering a particular case study. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found it some use.
So thank you very much. You're very welcome. It's great to see so many people here. In light of what Audrey was saying, I'm always nicely following on in giving you some examples from the international but also from the Irish perspective. And also I think this symposium is very timely and I think very unique in a way, because it's not only a symposium for or with journalists, but also with people from different disciplines. And I think if we want to make changes and improvements in this area, we have to move on with a stronger or strengthening from an interdisciplinary approach. During this presentation, I will convey to you some very positive and encouraging examples, but there's still also, unfortunately, evidence and examples out there that require improvement and enhancement. Here's some positives. So 2 journalists who clearly indicate and are quite convincing in terms of the benefits of using media guidelines in terms of the reporting of suicide, but also to some extent that applies to murder-suicide cases as well. Many of you are probably familiar with these journalists, and no surprise, these journalists also got the Media Award. And in that regard, I think there's a growing number of journalists who also can be considered a model-type journalist or have a fulfilling role there for other colleague journalists. Suicide contagion, already the 2 speakers alluded to some extent to this. Some people may think this is new, and particularly because of social media. It isn't. It goes back even several centuries. And one of the very convincing examples goes back to the 1700s, so the sorrows of young Werther. So young Werther took his life after a breakup of a relationship, and then in the months following his death, similar cases of suicide were discovered in other countries, but in a similar way and in a similar context. 1962, Marilyn Monroe, important follow-up research indicated that there was a 12% increase in suicide in the month following her death by suicide, and in most of these cases these were young women, so also the young women who considered Marilyn Monroe as an idol. And then moving on a bit further in time, there was a very striking impact of a TV film of a railway suicide of a young man who took his life. And in the weeks after his death, there was a 175% increase in railway suicide. This has been based on peer-reviewed information and has been disseminated in both the academic and general literature. So prior to this presentation, I reviewed again the international research, and there is no doubt at this stage anymore that we can say that research consistently shows evidence for the impact of sensationalized media coverage on suicide, increases of individual cases of suicide, or also clustering of suicide. Interestingly, and not so surprisingly, then the impact of this contagion is greater on people with similar gender and age-specific characteristics, and I will show you a few other striking examples of that. Overall, and I think this is to some extent encouraging, some people think, okay, any media reporting will probably hit an impact on all of us. That's not the case. It particularly hits those people who are currently not in a good place, who are currently vulnerable. And we've seen it in some of the recent copycat cases of murder-suicide as well, even though initially it may not have been so clear. Fortunately and encouraging for the journalists here today, there's also protective effects of media coverage, not only by media blackouts, because I still find that quite a rigorous measure, but particularly the more balanced reporting, so where even all the detrimental effects of a murder-suicide are being presented at the same time, indications in the same article can be given and should be given on what are important risk factors, what are important protective factors, but also what can people do here and now when they are in a similar situation. Social media is still containing so many challenges of us today, and even in this week with some indications of new programs like the Blue Whale program coming into Ireland. We're facing literally very big challenges now. But there's positives as well. So one of the big positives of social media is reaching a large population, and particularly maybe people who are potentially vulnerable, to encourage them with positive information on help-seeking behavior or how they can enhance their resilience and coping strategies. But the big challenge is how can we manage, how we can control information that a few weeks ago was very prevalent or prominent in Hong Kong, and already this week is very prevalent here in Ireland, such as this Blue Whale program. Some research has been conducted by one of my colleagues in the IASP, and there is a positive impact of the so-called multi-level suicide prevention programs, where also collaboration with journalists and adherence to media guidelines is very prominent. Some of the people here may still remember the so-called Bridge and Suicide cluster. This took place in 2008 in the UK. And most people here today, if they remember, they may think that was one of the biggest clusters we've ever seen, or it was a real cluster. Interestingly, the scientific evidence, so the scientific investigation that took place afterwards, indicates that this was a possible cluster of suicide among young people. So it wasn't even the biggest cluster. But what appeared was that the cluster cases and also the time span of the cluster reported in the media was bigger and longer than what it actually was. And this is again based on peer-reviewed independent evidence. I only have one photo there, which is already very suggestive and sensationalized. I still remember that there was a similar photograph on one of the headlines with, again, at the end, 2 or 3 black boxes and with a big question mark, who will be next? Now, that is very suggestive for those vulnerable young men or women who are currently out there. And if there's anything, I can't think of anything more striking than this example. So this is also based on independent peer-reviewed evidence. So some of you may remember that tragically Robert Enke, the German football player, goalkeeper, he took his life in 2009. And compared, even going back to years before, they have never seen such a significant increase in railway suicide. So in the 3 weeks after his death, there was an 81% increase in railway suicides in Germany. And to a large extent, the vast majority of these people were young men. And even up to 2 years later, there was still a 19% increase in railway suicides. So here are just some of the examples. So sensationalized photos giving specifics about the spot, the place, and some of these suicides after his death were also taking place in the same area. Connecting for Life, also Claire will say a little bit more about that. So the Connecting for Life suicide prevention strategy is there not to tell journalists what to do, but particularly to engage and collaborate with journalists to improve this area of suicide reporting and to have more consistency across the print media, but also the social media. My colleague, Niall McTiernan, he has been instrumental in doing this work in Ireland in recent times. So in recent times he reviewed 243 media articles relating to 4 different cases of suicide over a recent time span. And there's some positives and not so positives. So in 76% of the articles, no reference was made to help services, and this is a fundamental criterion in the media guidelines. 54% of the papers did not refer to wider issues or, for example, genuinely explanatory factors or risk and protective factors. About half still overemphasize community grief, and when that tendency is there in articles, it almost feels as if we're overwhelmed by this, we can't do anything, and it's an epidemic, and that is often not in line with the facts. Some good news that in 20% of the articles there was a listing of the details of the methods. I think it's still too much, but it is at least an improvement from what we have seen before. Also, and I think it was alluded to Audrey as well, sometimes the information initially can be very speculative, and this can cause fear and panic amongst many people in the country as well. And I do remember, and maybe Claire knows about that as well, but following the murder-suicide case in Cavan, the increase in telephone calls to the Samaritans was tripled, and particularly women who phoned the Samaritans saying, is this now something that can happen to all families or to any family in Ireland? Because the picture that was painted of that family was almost a fairy tale family. The wonderful, most stable family you could imagine. And then from one day, from a Sunday night to Monday morning, this happened. So panic, fear obviously can be instigated. So particularly one of the new issues we are looking at, and I would be very happy to continue collaborating with this department here as well, is what can we do to address misinformation, and in recent months we have some very striking examples of that. And this is something which is difficult to control for us because of the speed of social media, the speed of Twitter. And the same then applies for graphic details or pictures or videos where people take their lives or when people take the lives of others. And again, this can have a very suggestive and imitative effect on other vulnerable people. So staying very close to here in Ireland, I was involved in verifying in November that huge statement that went out, and it went as far as Dublin and further about the statement about 16 suicides in 16 days in Cork City. And if that would be true, we would be dealing with a cluster or with a certain epidemic. We were not given enough time to verify, so we worked day and night to verify whether this was true. And it's hard because we have a coronial system here, and that means that you don't have immediate access to all the cases. But with all the extra effort, we found in a day and a night that instead of 16 cases, we were dealing here with 3 cases at the most, where one of the 3 cases was a probable case of suicide. Now, the devastation, the anxiety and the panic that this message has caused was enormous, and that lasted even until Christmas. It also led to a huge increase in referrals of parents referring their young children to Pieta House and other services. So they felt we have to now have screening for all people because anybody could take his or her life. In addition to media guidelines, and I would say media guidelines wouldn't have that protective or preventive effect on its own, so it needs to be part of a response plan within communities when copycat or an emerging cluster of suicide arises, and that means leadership. It means that there needs to be a template to provide the immediate services, but also working with the journalist from the very start. And then lastly, but very, very importantly, we are literally in this week facing an important challenge in terms of social media. So there is this Blue Whale program that has come to us very quickly from Asia and Russia, and where particularly young vulnerable people could be impacted, and they're being exposed to so-called 50 steps towards escape, the escape of their life, and the escape is suicide. But they don't know that, or they may not realize that when they enter the first step of this program. And another important challenge we face is a new film that has been published on Netflix. It came from the US, where literally 13 reasons are being presented, particularly amongst a young girl who eventually takes her life. But the whole event of this young girl taking her life is put in scene up to the moment where she enters the bath, cuts herself, and then dies, and is being found by her parents. That is completely against any media guidelines. So literally, my colleague Niall and myself, we will be producing a briefing on this for the Department of Health and Media tomorrow. So just in summary, there are positive developments, and I think there's a growing engagement with journalists, but you can see here the ethical importance and also the preventative importance of implementing media guidelines. I do work closely with YASP and WHO as well, and we're currently in the process of updating the media guidelines as well, and with addressing as much as we can managing the social media area as well. Based on these findings, you can see how important research is as well, but also how important collaborating with us, with the journalists, is at the same time. So thank you very much.
Hello everyone, how are you? My name is Claire. I'm a news researcher with Headline Ireland, and we are Ireland's leading media monitoring group. We were set up originally in 2007, and we work as part of the Connected for Life programme. And I suppose what I'm saying is pretty much mirroring what the rest of the contributors here this morning have said. Just Ireland has this national media monitoring programme for the last 10 years, and we've used this to try and get in touch with journalists, to try and encourage conversation about how they cover mental health, and to issue them with guidelines of the correct use of terminology. And because it is a very difficult job for you to do that, and sometimes in the local aspect of things, you know the people who are involved, and you know exactly what the effects are in the community, but it's very hard to report on it. That's why we've been created. We tend to go to journalists' offices to try and give training to journalists. We have an award system in place to try and highlight the best possible coverage that there is on mental health and suicide. And we are also trying to encourage students to get involved from an early age when they're learning the basic skills of journalism, the who, what, where, why, when, how, and to try and figure out what exactly it takes for journalists to really take on this issue, because it's massive. So a little bit about the social contagion effect. I know it's been already alluded to. It's the main reason why we exist. Suicide is a process by which exposure to the suicidal behaviour of one or more persons influence others to die by or attempt suicide. So evidence suggests that newspaper coverage and television coverage of suicide can be associated with an increase of suicidal behaviour after the coverage, depending on how it is covered. The World Health Organization outlines certain ways of describing suicide in the news contribute to suicide contagion or copycat suicides. So as journalists, you do have responsibility to your readership, to your viewers, and to yourselves as people. You are also affected by these often difficult things to report. So few journalists like having to report the details of a suicide case, yet it is generally acknowledged that many suicides are newsworthy events. Headline aims to give media professionals the tools and support to tackle the difficult task of reporting on these issues in a positive way that reduces stigma and prevents copycat behaviour. So while we've been out and about with journalists in local offices particularly, we've taken a few comments down from what people have said to us. One of the most common ones is we have a fear of making an error, and that sometimes makes us avoid the subject. Our team is ill-equipped to deal with the calls that come to the news desk afterwards. We are always conscious of local repercussions for family. We find it hard to find people willing to be interviewed. In the 10 years that Headline has been in existence, there has been over 250,000 stories relating to mental health, suicide, various different illnesses such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. We also cover eating disorders as well, and that is an awful lot of articles to go through, and it has probably hardened us as researchers to some of the statistics, and it has probably hardened journalists to the real life consequences of these things. So we are trying to ensure that we try and get as up to date as possible online coverage as well. So how many suicides have been recorded in that time in Ireland? Well, according to research conducted by the CSO and the NSRF, there has been 4,777 people who died by suicide in the last 10 years. These are provisional figures, and that is the equivalent of a plane leaving every year from Ireland and not returning. So I've also put in the population of Ballybarra where we are today. I know journalists like to kind of narrow things down in perspective. So where we are today is called Ballybarra. I'm not a native of the area, but I presume this is what you call it. So Ballybarra here has a lecture register, 4,295 constituents in it. That would be eradicated if in terms of the entire population of this country in relation to suicide. How many self-harm cases have happened? There's been over 100,000, so 104,689 cases who presented to Irish A&Es between 2007 and 2015. That is only the figures that have presented to Irish A&Es. There's been many more who haven't. So we don't have exact figures on that. And how many families and friends are affected by mental health and suicide? Countless. I'm not sure of any of your backgrounds or where you've come from, but I'm sure you know someone that has experienced mental ill health, or you've been in a community setting where you know someone has died by suicide, and the effect that it has on the community afterwards is dramatic. We've been asked to kind of talk about murder-suicide as well, and it is quite a dramatic thing to happen to a community. We have found from research that 21 murder-suicides have been recorded in the Republic of Ireland since 2007. 51 people have lost their lives as a result. Now, I have a map there included of where these murder-suicides have taken place, and you can see that there is a number of cases in the south of the country, but it's not just particular to any area, and that is important to bear in mind as well when you're a local journalist trying to report on these issues. It's important not to over-dramatise things or sensationalise things as well. This is the first case that Headline had to deal with when they set up first. It was the Donlon family in County Wexford. I'm sure some of you will remember this picture. It was posted on most online formats at the time and on the front pages of many newspapers across the country. So here are some of the headlines that were written at the time of the deaths of the Dunn family. Deaths drove Monaghan couple to destroy family. He texted, "We're off to heaven now." They were the sensationalised things that were said. It kind of alludes to a suicide note, which was in the format of a text, and details of exactly what was written in that text were also mentioned. It's also noted here, this article on the bottom, they're two separate articles, but the method of which was used to die by suicide was also given in it. And we find that that's the main problem with articles. The method is often given, and it's nearly a how-to method for anyone who's vulnerable to reading or consuming news at the minute. And that's what we're trying to combat. 1 month after that case made the headlines and was pretty sensationalised throughout it, the Innes family in Donegal were the family affected. This was the case of Katrina and Caitlin Innes, and Katrina was a mother to Caitlin. Caitlin had just made her Holy Communion, and they both died as a result of murder-suicide. There was lots of articles at the time about how copycat suicide fears were spreading, and that doctors and all kinds of professionals were talking about the issue. So it did get a lot of medical backup, but we did find a lot of cases where the method was also included in the headline, in the first opening intro of most articles as well. So that was something that we really wanted to make sure journalists were educated on, and we did try and encourage classes at the time for that. So bring it up to 2016. The whole family, Ballyjames stuff, County Galvin. This is the two headlines here that are used are probably two of the worst ones that we've come across in this case, where there has been more. But we were competing against something else this time, and it was online content. The story broke, I think, around 4 o'clock the day. It was first trending on Twitter, and journalists were starting to compile their information. So we decided to send out a media alert. I myself contacted the Garda Press office to try and see if they would tell us if this was going to be something. No doubt many journalists, probably some in this room, might have been doing the same or have their own contacts. We were just trying to equip journalists with the media guidelines before they had a chance to start compiling their information. And we did get a lot of feedback from journalists afterwards saying that they really required this at the time of writing instead of being scolded for afterwards. So we are trying to get before the story hits instead of just afterwards. Some of the headlines here you can read yourselves, but deranged teacher, dad who slaughtered 3 boys and wife in frenzied attack named. The use of the word slaughtered, the use of the word frenzied, these words are just, they're not acceptable in journalism here, and they shouldn't be used in our opinion. They don't meet guideline criteria at all. And this bottom case here on the right hand side is from politics.ie. It's a forum, it's like boards.ie, and we were competing with content on that as well with people who have no basis in journalism, who are citizen journalists or bloggers, were contributing to that discussion online too. So we are conscious that that is the new way of communicating too, and we are trying to build communications with bloggers and people who are interested in areas of mental health as well, to try and encourage them to use guidelines when creating content too. Another interesting thing that came out when the whole family made headlines was the use of imagery. The family portrait, the showing of a happy family, that they had lived a pretty normal life, and the absence of the photograph of Clodagh Halls was also mentioned. There was also something that
we couldn't get her photograph.
They couldn't get her
No, I
photograph.
couldn't.
You
I was
couldn't.
there. We couldn't. We spent 2 days. Everybody's reading a huge amount into the fact that her photograph wasn't there. We couldn't get it.
Yeah. Well, it's just, I'm kind of talking to it about an aftermath of what has happened, not necessarily.
No, I'm just saying
Yeah.
we could not get Clodagh Hall's photograph. 4 of us tried for 2 days to get her photograph home to. That's why there was no photograph of it.
We also did notice though in the coverage of this, I'm not targeting anyone particularly here today, I'm not about that at all, but I just wanted to show you something as well that we have noticed when these stories do hit the headlines, that All Too Common Tragedy section there has literally a list of murder-suicides that have taken place in Ireland, and these also tend to give the method of how they've happened as well, and imagery that sometimes is considered a normal person going about their ordinary day life, and it does have connotations to it as well. So what are the guidelines for reporting on this? Do you know them? We have a few here today. I can also get you in touch with Smartens if you require them after today. So it's don't speculate on motives. Explain to interviewees that interviews may be broadcast or printed. Avoid disclosing the contents of any suicide note. We do notice even in the case of suicide that we're getting screenshots taken of Facebook posts or stuff like that that are nearly almost the new form of suicide note in a way, and we would ask journalists to be wary of posting some things like that on their online articles and including them as imagery. To publish premature estimates of killed or injured may cause panic. Photographs or images related to the particular suicide or self-harm can lead to imitative action by people who are vulnerable. Witness and survivor statements are perspectives, they're not conclusive. Advertising such locations may provide detail about methods of suicide and self-harm and may play a part in drawing more people to that location. Avoid brushing over the realities of suicide or self-harm. Avoid linking or mentioning the names of websites that encourage or glamorise suicide or self-harm, such as the Blue Whale is an online issue that we're trying to also get media wary of before it actually hits headlines here. Avoid explicit or technical details, imagery or method of murder-suicide or suicide in reports. Further to that, we always want journalists to know themselves the contact numbers for helpline services that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. One of those such helplines is the Smartens number. And it's not just for people that they're interviewing at the time of when they're trying to come up with a story or create a story. It's about themselves, it's about people in their locality. It's always important to have that number at hand. A dangerous message from the media is that suicide achieves results. It makes people sorry or it makes people eulogise. Encourage public understanding of the complexity of suicide and self-harm. Expose the common myths about suicide and self-harm. And it's important to also bear in mind that people don't decide to take their own life in response to a single event, however painful they may be. And social conditions alone cannot explain suicide either. The reasons an individual takes their own life are manifold, and suicide should not be portrayed as the inevitable outcome of serious personal problems. There was alluded to earlier about issues relating to deaths, issues relating to past diagnosis of depression or schizophrenia or other kind of illnesses as well. And remember the effect on survivors of murder-suicide, particularly family, friends and communities. So as I was talking to earlier about the helpline information, if any of you have phones out, I would advise you to take a picture or to try and include it in your contacts. The number for the Samaritans is 116123. They've made sure that it is now a free phone number and that it doesn't appear on bills or any kind of form of text, or you can't go back through to see who's contacted what, and you can email them as well. Also there's the icgp.ie website that has a list of local practitioners, GPs. There's the yourmentalhealth.ie, and then if in the case of an emergency, 999 or 112. So I said earlier about the role of social media and how we were trying to get to a story before it took place. We're also getting members of the public coming to the fore and saying that they don't want to read certain content about murder-suicide or suicide, and they have been reporting to us about cases they've read. So you see there, that was in response to the Ballyjames Stuff case. It's on the top left-hand corner there, and on the right-hand side, some journalists have commented about the use of the word committed suicide in broadcast. And it's also in publications that we've read it still, it's ongoing, and we're trying to make sure the journalists are aware of the correct phrases and terminology to use. So the correct phrases to use: suicide to take one's own life, person at risk of suicide, to die by suicide, death by suicide, suicide attempt or completed suicide. The words on the right hand side tend to have negative connotations, and for those who are vulnerable or for those who need to seek help, they don't help them. If you are looking to find out any more information about guidelines in relation to certain topics such as eating disorders or anything like that, do feel free to contact us. We're on Twitter, we're online, and you can give us a call as well at any time.
begin with two confessions. I have no visual aids. I belong to the pre-PowerPoint generation. And secondly, I have very little experience of journalism. In my 56-year career to date, I have spent 28 years as a diplomat and 28 years in the private sector, including 5 years as Chancellor here and Chairman of the governing body. My recent contact with journalism comes through my appointment as the Chair of the Press Council of Ireland, which has 6 journalists and 7 lay people, or 7 independent people. I can, however, confess that I have a lifelong addiction to reading newspapers. At one stage I took 17 newspapers a day, but I'm glad to tell you I've cut it down and I'm now down to 5. Irish, American, British and German. It's important to emphasise one thing about the Press Council. We are entirely independent. We are independent of government and we're independent of the press. We deal with virtually all the national and local papers in Ireland, the Irish editions of UK papers, and most of the main magazines. So all of these people voluntarily subscribe to our work, and specifically they agreed to abide by our code of practice. Those of you who are not familiar with the code of practice or indeed the structure of the organisation, I suggest you go to the website and look it up. This is our code of practice. I hope most journalists are aware of it, and I hope many of them carry it. Our recent experience in general is that the press in Ireland are sensitive in their reporting of suicide. This code of practice has only one principle which deals specifically with suicide. That's principle 5.4, which says, in the reporting of suicide, excessive detail of the means of suicide should be avoided. But other principles of the code are also relevant, including the principle of privacy and the principle on respect for rights. In preparing for this symposium, I looked up a major government report, an expert group on mental health policy, which was published over 10 years ago. I think you had some contribution to that report. And I was interested that there was no reference in the suicide section, which was quite a significant section, no reference whatever to the role of the media, which suggested to me, perhaps wrongly, that there was a feeling that the media either didn't have a role and certainly had no contributory responsibility to what was happening. So when the Press Council was set up at about the same time, 10 years ago, we were approached by the Samaritans, who expressed concern about the nature of some suicide reporting in Irish newspapers. The then Press Council looked at the matter and took the view that the general provisions of the code were sufficient to cover it. However, about 3 years ago, the Samaritans raised the matter again, this time against the background of the reporting of the death by apparent suicide of the actor Robin Williams. There were 2 concerns expressed to us. One was that there were a number of articles which appeared to justify suicide by glamorizing it and making the victim a hero. The second concern was that some of the coverage gave details of the means used in the suicide and thereby ran the risk of encouraging copycats. This time the Press Council looked at it, held a seminar, consulted suicide experts, and as a result agreed to add a specific guideline to the code of practice. We took the advice of the Samaritans and used the wording in the UK code, hence the principle that I've quoted to you: in the reporting of suicide, excessive detail of the means of suicide should be avoided. It's worth noting that since that principle was added, we have not had a single complaint about a possible breach of that. And when you consider we get about 320 complaints a year about breaches of different principles of the code, I think that is worth noting. And again, I think it indicates that perhaps in general the press is dealing sensitively with this matter. Claire Sheeran has highlighted or has dealt with 3 high-profile cases. The Press Council wasn't in existence in 2007, so we had no involvement in those cases. In regard to the Hall case in 2016, we were approached by the Samaritans, and I think maybe also by you, and concern was expressed at the nature of the immediate coverage. If I understand the position correctly, the concern centred on the fact that Mr. Haw, who had apparently committed suicide, was being portrayed as a victim. In response to these concerns, we issued an advisory notice to editors and attached to it a briefing document which your National Suicide Research Foundation had prepared. The episode highlights, incidentally, a feature of our work, the work of the Press Council, which may not be well known, and that is that we issue these advisory notices to editors covering all sorts of topics, but specifically including coverage of murder-suicides. We do so in specific cases, either on our own initiative or because we have been approached by or on behalf of people directly impacted, or by individuals or organisations with an established relevant reputation. Advisory notices are prepared very promptly and circulated immediately, usually within hours of receiving a complaint. So my conclusion, which may to this audience not be particularly professional, and indeed it may not be complete, but my conclusion is that in general, the handling of suicide, murder-suicide reporting by Irish media is sensitive, and I think the media should be, in effect, acknowledged and congratulated on that achievement. Now, I'm much more concerned about the future and about the task which regulators have because of the emergence of online and social media. The Press Council, incidentally, includes a small number of online news sources, including, for example, the journal.ie and evoke.ie. We're currently working to add some more, and we may have to consider changing our name from Press Council to something more relevant, but we can't easily find an alternative. If any of you have a suggestion, please let us have it. We can't really call ourselves Press and Media Council because we do not cover broadcasting. We can't call ourselves Press and Online because we don't cover online elements of broadcasting. So it's a bit complicated. But I'm very concerned about the major online news sources, particularly Facebook, Twitter, the big ones. They're global, and they appear to be beyond any effective regulation, voluntary or governmental. Facebook is a giant in the world of news, though they don't even admit it. They seem to want to deny the fact that they are sources of news, even though most of the surveys that I have seen indicate that more than 50% of people take their news not from newspapers, but from online and from social media. Facebook, as I say, refuses to acknowledge that it is a publisher, and it refuses to recognize that its use of algorithms to monitor and edit material is no substitute for employing qualified journalists. I think it's extraordinary that we have a situation where news is edited, prepared and distributed by machines and not by people. And I think that should be made better known. And at a time when these global giants, such as Facebook, are increasing in popularity, and they're eating into revenue traditionally available to the press, and thereby threatening the very survival of the press, it's clear that action is urgently required. Why should the press in Ireland have to compete with news sources which are subject to no regulation and which are hoovering up their traditional sources of revenue? There's widespread concern internationally, but so far no action. I sense the beginning of moves in some countries, particularly in relation to companies whose social media platforms do not respond swiftly enough to complaints about illegal content relating, for example, to hate speech, terrorist propaganda, and fake news. In Germany recently, there is a proposal to introduce fines of up to $50 million for obvious offences. There's also, I notice, the beginning of a limited voluntary code of conduct by a number of companies, including Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. But it's very, very limited, and it's aimed simply at fighting the spread of hate speech. While this and other measures are to be welcomed, we're a long way from having an effective internationally agreed mechanism which will ensure that editorial decisions are made not by machines but by people who understand notions of public interest and have an understanding of the essential values of journalism, which are accuracy, impartiality, humanity, transparency, and accountability. I think the new social media will not on their own take the required action, nor should it be a matter either for governments or intergovernmental organisations. It has to be, as it is in Ireland today, it has to be a voluntary code drawn up by the social media and supervised by some independent body created by them. Governments, I think, do have a role in circumstances where the voluntary work is not emerging. Government sometimes has to use a stick, as the Germans are currently doing. In other words, introduce heavy penalties for breaches of good journalistic practice. Hopefully, this might encourage the international news giants to come together and agree a voluntary code of best practice and create the machinery necessary to supervise it. But without action now, the press as we have known it will no longer be able to function, and in particular, it will no longer be able to continue to play its vital role in the promotion and maintenance of democracy. Thank you very much indeed.